One.
Good evening and welcome to a special joint meeting of the City Council and School Committee called by Mayor David J. Narkowitz in accordance with Northampton Charter, Section 7-2 Annual Budget Policy. It's Thursday, January 28th, 2021. This meeting is being held in accordance with Governor Baker's emergency order regarding the open meeting law. So it is a Zoom meeting. It is being audio and video recorded and broadcast by Northampton Open Media. And I would ask participants to please mute yourselves and obviously when the meeting is happening, if you're not participating in the meeting, if you would also turn your screens off just so that it's easier for the chair to see the members of the school committee and the city council. I will kick off the meeting by asking the administrative assistant to the city council, Laura Krutzler, to please call the roll of the joint meeting.
Sure. Member Basansky. Can't see who's here or not, so I'll allow a moment.
I don't see Member Basansky yet. Nope.
Member Condon.
Present.
Member Fallon.
Present.
Member Gold.
Present.
Member Goldman.
Present.
Member Kaufman.
Present.
Member Levy. Not here.
No, here.
Present. Sorry, I'm here.
Mayor Narkowitz.
Present.
Member Seraphy Cox.
Present.
And Member Voss.
Present.
And then for the city council, Councilor Dwight.
Here.
Councilor Foster.
Here.
Councilor Jarrett.
Here.
Councilor Labarge. No, I saw her. Councilor Labarge.
Here.
Councilor Maori. Not present. Councilor Nash.
Here.
Councilor Quinlan.
Here.
Councilor Shara.
Here.
Councilor Thorpe.
Here.
And Mr. Mayor, you have a quorum.
Excellent. Thank you. And I also just want to note we are in the process of making a change to our charter. But when this was written, the charter only recognized the Northampton School Committee as in this joint meeting. And we do have an amendment that's been sent to the legislature as part of some other amendments that would also add our other school district and the Board of Trustees of Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School, of which I'm also a member, and actually Dr. Provost is a member. And so for future years, it would truly be a joint meeting of the three governing bodies, both school districts as well as the city council. But I do want to recognize that Dr. Lincoln Hooker is here from Smith Vocational, as well as I know Trustee Cotton is here, and I do not see if any other trustees are with us. And then obviously Dr. Provost is with us as well from Northampton Public Schools. And just to review, this section of the charter says that the mayor shall call a joint meeting of the city council and school committee, including the superintendent of schools, before the commencement of the budget process to review the financial condition of the city, revenue and expenditure forecasts, and other relevant information prepared by the mayor in order to develop a coordinated budget. We typically hold this meeting by design at the end of January, and often we try to time it for after the governor, whoever that is, has submitted their budget so that we at least have some indications. And Governor Baker submitted his budget yesterday, so hot off the press. So we were incorporating it last night and today into the presentation. So as always, I have a slideshow that I'm going to share with you and with the public and go through some slides, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So Again, this is sort of an annual process, and these are the financial trends and projections for what will be the fiscal year 2022 budget. So the agenda for tonight, some familiar topics that we'll go over. We will look at some of the financial indicators for Northampton relative to comparison communities. We'll look at our reserves and review why our reserves are such an important part of our ability to create an operating budget. We're going to look at budgeting during COVID, which is obviously was a big part of last year's budget process and will certainly continue to be a part of the FY 2022 process. We'll review revenue and expenditure trends for FY 2022. We'll discuss the fiscal stability plan and just provide an update on where we stand there. And then we'll just quickly review the fiscal year 2022 budget calendar, which is in some cases laid out by the charter as well. And then we'll have time for questions and comments at the end. So I'll just kick right into it here. These are a few slides that we typically look at just to see where Northampton is as we move forward from budget year to budget year, how we compare to neighboring communities. And we select a group of neighboring communities that should all be familiar to you. They're all cities and large towns all around us: Agawam, Amherst, Chicopee, East Hampton, East Longmeadow, Greenfield, Holyoke, Longmeadow, Northampton, of course, South Hadley, Westfield, and West Springfield. And these have been our comparators for these presentations for the last 7 or 8 years. So here's our residential tax rate. This is the tax rate that taxpayers would pay per thousand on their tax rate. It's $17.37, and you can see Northampton is in orange, and you can see sort of where we stand in terms of our residential tax rate compared, say, with Longmeadow, which is at $24.74. The actual legal limit under Prop 2.5 is $25 per thousand. So they're approaching that limit. Commercial tax rates, we have a factor of 1, so we do not have a split commercial and residential tax rate. So our commercial tax rate, $17.37, as well compares favorably not only with these comparators, but also across the Commonwealth. And again, you can see the differences between some of our larger industrial cities that have larger commercial tax bases, or in some cases used to have a large commercial tax bases, and they have a much higher commercial tax rate. This is the average single family home value in these comparison communities. You can see Northampton has very strong home values. The average single family home is valued at $334,059. This is all data that we pull from Department of Revenue, so it's all coming from a centralized source. And as you'll hear later, values have continued to be strong, and the residential market has continued to be strong. And you can see how we compare in this regard, third to only Longmeadow and Amherst in the value of our properties. The average single family tax bill for 2021 was $5,803. Again, that is when you basically apply that assessed value to the per thousand tax rate, and that gives you this 5,803, and you can kind of see where we fall there on the spectrum. Total new growth. You hear new growth a lot, and you hear it when we go through talking about how the calculation for Proposition 2.5 happens. But new growth is basically any new property, any new taxable property that's added to the tax base in a fiscal year. So that could be a new building, it could be a new home, it could be a new wing on a hospital. It's anything that is new for the fiscal year. And it's significant because that's the one way you can actually grow your, create more revenue and grow your tax base beyond your existing taxable property. Northampton had, as you can see, the second highest new growth in terms of the value of that new growth. So of all those new buildings and commercial buildings and residential homes that were built, about a $62 million worth of new value. And you can see Northampton was very strong in the valley in that regard. So that then translates to what we are allowed to then add to our levy each year, which is the total amount of new growth revenue in taxes. So when applied against our tax rate, the value in terms of new revenues from that growth was $1,039,583. You can see here, there are some communities that raise more revenue. And those are cases where, again, they have set their commercial tax rate higher because they, in some cases, have a much higher split or a more even split between commercial and residential tax base. So you can see Northampton, though, is still very strong in terms of new growth, which is important as we think about how we sustain revenue. It's also a good indicator of our local economy that people are investing and building in Northampton. This is a slide we've never shown before, and they only had data for 2019, but I thought it was an interesting one to sort of add in here. This is debt per capita, so looking at the combined debt of all of these communities, and that would be debt for schools, for cities, for capital improvements, and basically then figuring out how much it is per capita, depending on the population of each community. You can see that Northampton is sort of on the lower half at $1,821 of debt per capita. And then you can sort of see the range from Amherst down at $305 all the way up to Chicopee, which is approaching $3,000 per capita. But I know that we frequently talk about our capital plan. We talk about the borrowings that we do to whether it's for school or city capital projects or paving or other things. And we have very strict debt policies about the limits on our debt, but I think it's useful to kind of see it and see how we are compared to other communities in terms of how much debt we actually have relative to our neighbors. This is this actually shows the breakdown of general fund revenue and the various sources that make up that. And this is one we show every year. We're actually missing a few this year because Chicopee, East Longmeadow, Holyoke, and Westfield have not yet filed their Schedule A with the Department of Revenue, so we don't have their updated numbers. But it's important, and it does show some unique characteristics about Northampton. The large blue part of the bar is the normal property taxes, sort of the main property taxes that most communities rely on to fund their operating budgets. And then the lighter blue is state revenue, and then red is local receipts. And these are sort of other unique local receipts for each community. In our case, it would be things like parking revenue. It would be things like the hotel motel local option tax, the local option tax on meals, on cannabis, on Airbnb. And you can see sort of two things that this shows. Of these communities, we get the smallest percentage, second smallest percentage of our revenue from state aid. Only Longmeadow has a smaller proportion of its revenue coming from state aid. And then the other important component is sort of the outsized amount of local receipts that comprise our revenues. And again, because we have a very robust hotel, motel, and restaurant industry, and obviously we've been leaders in the cannabis industry, we have come to be able to generate a pretty good percentage of this type of local revenue. Of course, as we'll talk about later, one of the challenges and one of the hardest hit parts of our revenue has been these local revenues during COVID, and we'll talk about that. But it's important to see sort of the percentage of where the revenue comes from. Still a large percentage, over 66%, coming from the traditional property taxes. So let's shift gears quickly to just talk about our reserves. This is something that some have accused me of being a broken record about. It's something that we've worked really hard on over the past Well, this is my 10th and final budget. So over the last 10 years, we've been focused on this. And financial reserves are important for a lot of reasons. I talked a little bit about those during the town hall meetings for the override, but obviously they provide us financial flexibility when we have things like natural disasters, flooding, snowfall, hurricanes, when we have major infrastructure failures, whether it's a building boiler or a bridge has to be closed due to structural deficiencies or roof leaks. There's also economic downturns, regional or national, that sometimes require us to use our reserves. And then, obviously, there's the once in a lifetime global pandemic, which of course none of us have experienced in our lifetimes, but has had obviously not only a devastating public health impact, but also a devastating economic impact as well, not only in the private sector, but obviously cities and schools. So financial reserves provide us operational stability for those situations. It also allows us to be able to fund a robust capital improvement program so we can invest in our equipment and in our buildings, and we can make sure that our operational efficiency remains high and ultimately save tax dollars. It keeps our credit rating high, which in turn results in lower borrowing costs when we go out to borrow for those large projects. And it has also allowed us to create financial or fiscal stability and create financial plans and financial models that actually rely on those reserves to allow us to maintain stability in our budgeting over extended periods of time as the costs of expenses and fixed costs and contract costs, et cetera, rise at a steady rate. And then, as we'll talk about later on, our revenues locally are capped by Prop 2.5, and obviously state aid and in some cases, local revenues can suffer downturns as well. So maintaining adequate reserves helps leave us in a better position to deal with funding issues in difficult times, and it gives us those tools to be able to maintain a continuity of services. So what are the different types of financial reserves that we have? We have four main reserves funds in the general fund. We've got the general fund stabilization fund, which is sort of an all-purpose. We've got the capital stabilization fund, which, as the name implies, is intended to fund capital improvements. We've got the general fund fiscal stability stabilization fund. This is intended solely for stabilizing the operating budget. And this, of course, was established back in 2013 as part of the first fiscal stability plan that I presented to the voters then, which, coupled with a $2.5 million override, allowed us to create originally what we thought was 4 years, but ended up allowing us to create 7 years of stability by using that fund. And we'll look at that later to help stabilize and backfill our budget when our expenses began to outstrip our revenues. And then we have the undesignated fund balance, or free cash as it's called. And this is basically any of the funds that remained unspent at the end of the fiscal year and get certified by the Department of Revenue. And then we are allowed to use them. We use those again for often emergency measures to close out the fiscal year, and things like snow and ice, other overages, and then we also use it to fund a healthy and robust capital improvement plan. Actually, Susan Wright just reminded me 7 years was ingrained in my head from those presentations. It's actually 8 years now. We're in our 8th year. So the other stabilization funds we have are the 4 enterprise fund stabilizations. Those are in each of our 4 enterprise funds: water, sewer, solid waste, and stormwater and flood control. Those operate as individual cost centers, and the reserves that are developed in those accounts must stay in those accounts and can be only used for the purposes of those different utilities. So those are the different funds. What are the balances in those funds? These are the current balances in our general, on our 4 general fund reserves. You can see the general fund stabilization, the capital stabilization, the fiscal stability stabilization, and then our free cash. And as I had said in our budget message this time last year, obviously thankful to the City Council for supporting our steady and disciplined approach to replenishing our reserves over the last 8 years. And our strong reserve position will play a critical role in our ability to successfully navigate the uncharted economic and budgetary waters ahead. And that obviously was in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of our bond rating, which I referenced, you can see here over to the side, these are the same comparison communities and what the bond ratings for our respective comparison community neighbors are. Northampton's is AAA, and then you can see from Agawam and Amherst down to Holyoke, the various different bond ratings. We did have our bond rating rechecked in October as we were going out for some borrowing, and Standard & Poor's reviewed our balance sheets and went through all of our policies and looked at our budget and reviewed all of the other documents that they request. And they did, in fact, affirm once again our AAA bond rating. They, in a couple of quick quotes, we view the city's management as very strong, with strong financial policies and practices under our FMA methodology, indicating that financial practices are strong, well embedded, and likely sustainable. And then they actually called out the override that was adopted on March 3rd, 2020. The city approved a $2.5 million general operating override of the levy limit, which in our view demonstrates additional revenue raising flexibility. The city has delayed the implementation of the override by a year and plans to include it in its fiscal 22 budget. Officials indicate this is part of the city's long-term fiscal stability plan and is aimed primarily at paying for ongoing operations and increasing municipal services for residents. And then obviously it talks about this fiscal stability reserve. So I don't just talk about this with you, we share it with outside rating agencies, and they review it in terms of whether or not it's a fiscally sound process and practice. This is our reserves over the last 10 plus years rather. You can see that as we've slowly rebuilt our reserves, again, down here in FY10, FY11, FY12 was coming out of the Great Recession. And so we had really relied on our reserves heavily to weather that. And so we began, 2013 was the first budget that I worked on, and we began to slowly work to rebuild our reserves over time. And you can see how, as they've grown, our bond rating has reflected that as well. So, budgeting during COVID-19, how is the city navigating the pandemic? And in FY 2021, which is what we are in right now, we took several steps, as you know, to be able to balance the 2021 budget as a result of the pandemic. First and foremost, as I referenced before, we did delay use of the $2.5 million override, the additional revenue capacity that was afforded by the taxpayers when they voted on March 3rd, 2020. Because it was right in the beginning of COVID and we were in such economic uncertainty, businesses were closed, I made the decision that we would delay that implementation, and instead we made several steps within the budget itself to be able to address the loss of that potential new revenue. We eliminated $365,000 of planned funding for cash capital projects. We eliminated $400,000 in a planned contribution to the Capital Stabilization Fund. We eliminated 17.25 full-time equivalent positions across a number of city departments. We eventually ended up needing to use $411,367 of our fiscal stabilization funds to cover shortfalls in the FY 2021 operating budget. We scaled back our capital improvement program. About the only area where we had to make significant increases was, not unsurprisingly, in our health department, where we made significant increases to create more staff for our public health nursing staff, contact tracing, and more recently working on both testing and vaccinations. So that was the one area, obviously, during the pandemic that we made significant increases in staffing. Then, as we moved through the final phases of the budget process, the City Council then made some additional cuts to the budget, reduced the Northampton Police Department budget, which amounted to a reduction eventually of $882,602 from what was originally proposed in the budget. That included cuts in personnel, 5 full-time equivalents, operating supplies, and funds for all proposed vehicle replacements. These cuts reduced the original amount of the one-time money that we were proposing to take from the Fiscal Stabilization Fund, which we were proposing to use $935,020 to support the operating budget. So it did reduce the amount. Of course, we then had to increase that amount during the middle of the fiscal year when it came time to set the tax rate, because so many of our revenues that we had projected in our budget, even though we had projected them to decrease our local revenues, they still continued to lag behind. So we were not able to set our tax rate without adjusting up, without putting basically additional revenue into the budget. So we again relied on the Fiscal Stabilization Fund, which is what that is for, to stabilize the operating budget. We had no increase in state aid, level funding by the Commonwealth of our key state aid accounts, such as Chapter 70 and the unrestricted general government aid account. So that was basically level funded by the governor, obviously better than cuts, but still not insignificant. And then we saw reduced local revenue estimates. We began reducing down estimates for those local revenue streams I mentioned earlier, including the hotel motel excise, meals excise, marijuana excise, parking tickets, building permits, et cetera, because we knew that with hotels closed, restaurants limited, we were going to need to scale those back significantly. We reduced the recreation revolving funds contribution to the general fund, basically 100%. We knew that we would not be receiving any contribution from rec programs. We did not propose an increase in water and sewer rates, so there was no increase in water and sewer rates. That we did then have to use $1.2 million in our water and sewer reserves to cover losses in water and sewer revenue due to usage changes during COVID-19. Obviously, those same hotels, restaurants, Smith College, other large institutions that were not using the same levels of water that they were when they were operating normally, as well as certainly some restaurants as well. In terms of additional impacts, we then did increased spending on investments in technology. Obviously, we had to spin up online government, both on the city side as well as in the school side, putting in place remote work infrastructure, both hardware and software, as well as working on the public's interface with the city via the web. And additional things like online contracting or paperless contracting, and a number of other things that were required to keep folks safe during COVID. And obviously online learning and remote learning in our schools was a major part of that as well. Obviously, I've already mentioned the additional public health staff. We have received unprecedented federal aid in the form of the CARES Act funding, and all told, that's provided over $3 million to the city and schools to help us pay for the purchases of PPE and cleaning and disinfection costs, overtime for first responders and health department staff, some of the air quality improvements that we've made in our schools with air handlers and HEPA filters, as well as in our city buildings. Obviously, the COVID-19 testing that we've been doing for our municipal and school employees, as well as at-risk community members and even some employees and businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19, as well as that remote work and remote learning infrastructure. Of that $3 million, about 2/3 of it has gone to the schools. They did receive some direct, as well as the city allocating a significant portion. So about 2/3 of that $3 million has gone to the schools. And while these are funds that came to us in terms of these emergency grants, I want to make sure that you understand that, this did require staffing, and it required us shifting resources, both administrative and oversight, to be able to redeploy staff to work on some of these new priorities, obviously, that did not exist prior to COVID-19. Obviously, there are also additional social and economic impacts. I'm not going to read this entire slide, but it'll be there. But obviously, we've done significant work on housing and food insecurity in Northampton, working with neighboring communities as part of the network to end homelessness, working with our partners ServiceNet and MANA, as well as Elliott Homeless Services. We stood up a shelter at high school early in the pandemic and have worked with our partners to help set up an expanded emergency shelter at First Churches. We've provided emergency funding assistance to our local food providers, as well as we stood up local resources downtown in the form of hand washing stations and porta potties and other things like that. For folks who were unable to use indoor facilities because of the closures of some of the normal places like Forbes Library and public buildings, as well as private restaurants. We've been continuing, or we've accelerated the development of our community resilience hub to try to provide some of these services. So we're trying to bring both staffing, grant writing, as well as other city resources to bear on that project. We've also done similar work in terms of assisting the business community, streamlining permitting so that we could get people set up quickly outdoors for outdoor dining. We've received grants to do public modifications to the public way, some successful, others maybe not so successful or popular, but all with the goal of trying to make it safer and create more public space for people to be able to come downtown safely and social distance and move in and through our downtown. And we're also done some other things working with the Community Development Block Grant Program to do small grants to businesses as well. So we've tried to also allocate city resources directly to both the social and economic impacts of COVID-19, as well as staffing resources. So when you look at the 2020 budget to the 2021 budget, 2021 was actually slightly lower, $460,049 or 0.46% less than the budget of the previous year. And again, we were not applying the override, we were delaying the override. So we really needed to slow down the growth of the budget because we didn't have the additional revenue from the override, which is why we made those selected cuts that I described earlier. So FY 2020, budgeting in the unknown. We were certainly budgeting in the unknown in FY 2021 at the start of the pandemic, and in many ways we're continuing to do that. Unsure really about what the short term as well as what the prognosis economically will look like over the next two fiscal years in 22 and 23. What we do know is obviously our financial world is uncertain and will depend heavily on the availability and success of the vaccination program, which we know here in Massachusetts has not gotten off to an auspicious start, and we're hoping to get that back on track. That's not the case locally. Our health department has been once again a leader and has had a regional vaccination site up at the senior center, trying to vaccinate as many people in phase 1 as possible. Although our big problem has been vaccine supply, and we're prepared obviously to assist in phase 2 as well once we can get the logjam in terms of vaccination supply opened up. We're obviously going to continue to absorb the financial impact of other public health mitigation measures that we have to put in place. And so we're slowly starting to see the budget come into focus. Obviously, we got the governor's budget yesterday. We'll talk about that. We're starting to look and do some modeling with our local receipts. Health insurance, we're not quite there in terms of what our health insurance rates are. So at the beginning of the process, we're beginning to gather the information, but there still is a lot of uncertainty. There's also the possibility of stimulus funds coming from the federal government. Obviously, the former administration and the stimulus bill that was passed by Congress very explicitly did not have funding for states and cities. And so we're hopeful that there may be that additional funding coming under the Biden-Harris administration. So we do have to plan that we could be in a recession, possibly 18 months or even longer in terms of how long we continue to see these revenues, especially the local revenues, lagging in line with our local economy. Oops, sorry about that. So basically what we have to do now is figure out how we're going to ensure our longer term fiscal stability for both that 22 and 23 budget and beyond, in order to see if we can continue with our long-term fiscal stability plan. So let's look at revenues and expenditure projections for FY22, and this is for the general fund. These are the current revenues for the general fund, 100,198,808. You can sort of see the breakdown. Again, we saw it in a different slide before, taxes representing about almost 70%, state revenue 15.74%, and then you can see all the various other smaller types of revenue. You can see the mighty federal revenue at 0.08%. And then you even see Fiscal Stability Fund, which ultimately contributed 0.41% to the operating budget. So in terms of major revenue sources that we rely on in the general fund and our projections for 2022, obviously real estate and personal property, state aid, major categories, which we'll look at in a moment, unrestricted government, general government aid, Chapter 70, which is the basically school aid, charter school aid, et cetera. And then there's those local receipts that we talked about earlier, which are sort of specific to Northampton and where we've been successful in generating that 14+% of our overall general fund revenue. So in terms of revenue strictly from real estate and personal property, these are sort of the three numbers we looked at in the calculations for how Proposition 2.5 works. We have the Proposition 2.5 increase above the levy of 1.668265. We have our estimate for new growth, which we are going to use an estimate of 750. And then we have the implementation of the March 3rd, 2020 override at 2.5 million. So we have this potential of 4.9 million in new revenues that we can work with as we work to develop the FY 2022 budget. In terms of new growth in Northampton, I mentioned that new growth estimate. You can see how our new growth has tracked over time. And again, we've been very strong in the last several fiscal years, including even in fiscal year 21, despite the pandemic. But you can also see that in those years after the Great Recession, we did see decreases and slowdowns. So far, you'll see later, we do see slowdown in building permits, but we still have significant growth. There are still significant projects underway in the city. There's still build out happening at Village Hill. There's construction happening on King Street, Pleasant Street, and obviously lots of residential construction happening in the city. So, but that's a key number, because as that dips, that means that our tax base is not growing as much, and that's a loss of potential revenue to the city's tax base. So another thing that we have to be mindful for, and this is very much COVID-19 related, and we actually attended the MMA virtual annual meeting and trade show, and the Department of Revenue held a workshop that I've probably been to 16 or 17 times, and this year was unlike any other year because they really focused on this issue of tax assessments. Obviously, the way tax assessments are done, and this is on residential and commercial property, is, for FY 2021, it's the value of those properties on January 1st of 2020. So obviously, the 2021 values really were not affected by COVID, because January 1st, 2020 was before everything went downhill with COVID. But when we look at the FY 2022 assessments of fair market value, those will be based on the values at January 1st, 2021. Now, we do have a strong residential property values, not only across the state, but here in Northampton. The Boston Globe reported that that property values are rising across the state. Obviously, mortgage rates are low. There's more first-time home buyers, and there's obviously a lot of people desiring to move move into places with more space and more moving out of cities and into places with more space. I know when I talk to my to professionals in the real estate market this year, they have had a really low supply of houses, and houses have been selling above asking price, bidding wars, et cetera. And obviously that's a combination of demand, but also the low mortgage rates obviously can drive up the cost. On the commercial and industrial side, this is again an area that we have to be very sensitive of, because when we look at the commercial value of a property, the fair market value, it's not just the square footage and the size of the building and the sort of those types of calculations, but there's also an income piece to that as well. Those commercial taxpayers receive a survey every year that they provide that type of information to us that goes into factoring what the ultimate fair market value assessment. Obviously, some businesses are doing quite well. Frontline stores like big box retail and grocery stores and fast foods, but obviously we also have others like hotels and motels that have not been generating their normal revenue. We have obviously businesses that may be closed or vacant properties, so they are not generating the same levels of residency. Occupancy rates for hotel motels is down across the state. And in Hampshire County, it's down 69%. So that's going to have an impact. So, DOR has been providing guidance to assessors. So that is something that we'll have to look at in terms of how long this downturn will last. It could have an impact on those fair market value assessments, which then in turn obviously has an impact on the revenue that would be generated from a particular property. Personal property taxes, which is more on equipment, obviously that will also be impacted by businesses that closed, for example, by January 1st of 2021. So you would lose the personal property tax on any equipment associated with that business. So the governor introduced his budget yesterday. And we got our cherry sheets from DOR, which basically give us the breakdown of how much we would receive in the various revenue categories, as well as what the assessments would be for various things, including special education, charter school sending tuition, school choice sending tuition. The big one is Chapter 70 school aid. That's one that we obviously look at. That's our school aid. And you may have heard the governor had been trumpeting that he is fully implementing or on schedule the Student Opportunity Act. You also know that in last year's budget presentation and during the town hall meetings, that while I have obviously joined others in celebrating the Student Opportunity Act, it does not have a significant impact for Northampton. Northampton will continue to be a minimum aid community, at least the way we project it over the next several years, which means that we receive a minimum aid increase of $30 per student in Chapter 70. So, which for Northampton, 70, well, it's you see it here. For NPS, it's 79,680, and for the well, we'll get to it on the next slide. For Smith Voc, it's a little over $2,000. So it's a fairly minimal increase in Chapter 70. And then in unrestricted government aid, which is the other account, that one is going up as well, and it's going up by 3.5%. But the most important number to look at really is down here, which is the net state aid. So basically taking all the revenues that are coming in from the state and then looking at all the charges against those revenues. And so while Chapter 70 aid may have been going up, other things like charter school sending tuition or reimbursements from charter school may go down, as well as other assessments. So under the governor's budget, we are projecting that we'll actually receive a decrease in net state aid from the Commonwealth in FY22 of basically a reduction of $64,766. So obviously, on $10 million worth of aid. So not a major aid increase, net state aid, focusing on education aid, because obviously that's something we talked about during the Student Opportunity Act discussion. Here, we've just broken it out to show what net education aid would be to the city. And again, we've got the increase of Chapter 70 of 83,160. That's basically taking the number of students at NPS and Smith Voc and giving us $30 for each kid extra above what we received last year in Chapter 70. You can see our tuition reimbursement for has gone down this year by 67,000. Then you go over to the other tuition assessments for school choice, charter school, which basically means they're projecting level funded, and then charter school sending tuition is going up 133,327. So when you perform that same net exercise, school aid is actually going down 119,654, or a 1.69% reduction in education aid, which obviously education's a major portion, 55% of our budget. So that is a significant, in terms of not even receiving a minimum increase, but an overall decrease. And then you see down here, I have broken down what Chapter 70, how it breaks down again on a per pupil basis. So of that number, 83, you see 79,680 goes to NPS and 3,480 go to Smith Voc. The other thing that's happening, it appears that by looking at the sheets that we're, to date, I believe we're being held harmless. I don't know if that will remain, but we have seen a decrease, at least on the NPS side, in the total number of students in terms of our student census. And I know the superintendent reported to the school committee that that's a situation happening across the state. DESE is showing us with 89 fewer students in NPS. On the Smith Voc side, they're showing with 3 more students. But again, one of the other trends that we're seeing is students leaving districts for whatever reason during the pandemic, which then obviously, if aid is based on a per pupil basis, that affects our calculation as well. So something for us to keep an eye on the school side. So looking at net state aid, that negative number from 2002 to FY 2022, you can see that net state aid has been generally flat over the last several years, a few little upticks here and there, but certainly not at the levels that it was in 2002 when it was approaching $14 million a year. It sort of hovered around the $10 million mark. And why is that important? It's important because if you look at a chart of our expenses over that time, everything from health insurance, salaries, the fixed costs of utilities and other kinds of costs that we have to pay, those are marching up on an annual basis with normal inflation. And if state aid stays flat, then that just continues to put more and more pressure on local revenues, primarily property tax, as well as those other local taxes. But of course, with the added restriction that property taxes are capped at 2.5% growth under Proposition 2.5. So while I know that there's been talk about increasing aid and aid to schools through the Student Opportunity Act, at this point, Northampton is not enjoying significant additional aid, and we continue to see issues related to the way charter schools are funded. So that's, again, remains some of the unfinished business of true education reform in Massachusetts. So those local receipts that I talked about as well, and we've sort of drilled down into really a handful of them that will look familiar, but this is important as we look at projections for for 2022. When we look at some of the drops that we've seen in these percentages between FY 2020 and FY 2021, you can see that we've seen drops in a lot of them. I mean, well, here's hotel motel tax. That one kind of jumps off the page. Almost a 76% reduction in revenue from hotel motel tax. Meals tax, almost 36%. You can see parking revenues, 68% drop. And then on down the line, certain licensing fees and other things where our local revenues have really been struck significantly. So even just taking this snapshot of this sort of 6% of the budget, you can see that we've seen almost a $2 million drop between 20 and 21, which is about a third of where those revenues were in the previous fiscal year. So those local receipts are an issue, and we'll zoom in a little bit on some of them just to talk about them historically, which also again illustrates how much we have been challenged by them during COVID. You can see hotel motel taxes in blue and meals taxes in brown. This is the local option that we collect on those, have been fairly steady, actually fairly strong over the last several years. Obviously, you can see for FY21, we're only 2 quarters in, but you can see that it's lagging behind significantly. We've done actually a chart of those hotel motel excise tax for the 3 fiscal years prior, 2019, 2020, and 2021. Gray is 2019. This dark blue is 2020. And then the one with a little COVID virus bug on it is FY 2021. And you can see, in the first quarter of 2019, we were collecting 207,769. Fast forward to the first quarter of 2021, 66,469. And you can see similar drops due to COVID in hotel motel excise tax. Obviously, many of our hotels have been shut down. Some did try to remain open, but eventually, because of travel restrictions and all the other barriers, many of them have shut down. Some have reopened, actually working with Smith College as part of their quarantine program for new students. But on the whole, this has been a significant revenue drop that we have to factor in for 2022. This is the meals excise tax. Again, same breakdown. Again, you can see the same drops in revenue in 2021, going from the first quarter to the second quarter to the fourth quarter, and you can see the impacts. And again, I want to be clear, for 2021, we did adjust our revenue expectations down because we knew that we would be experiencing. We sort of saw the big drops in the first quarter of COVID. So we did, estimate those down, but still, you're still seeing significant loss of revenue in that sector. Parking is another one. Parking pretty much got shut down almost immediately when the governor closed everything in the beginning, when everything was shut down, including stores. And so parking revenue obviously has been significantly hit. And you can see, again, the breakdown over the last 3 fiscal years. Adult use marijuana excise tax. Now that had been going down slowly because of market share, but then obviously there were closures, or there was a closure at one point when adult use marijuana was shut down under one of Governor Baker's orders. There was also during the vape ban, there was some closure or loss of revenue there, but obviously COVID, you can see, has had an impact quarter over quarter, year over year in those same quarters over time. The fourth quarter payment of 2020 down to 271,144, which is probably the lowest quarter that we've had. So one positive note, for whatever reason, there's actually been an increase in motor vehicle excise tax. Apparently motor vehicle sales have gone up. I've talked sort of anecdotally with folks in the car business, and they've said that this has been, 2020 was one of their strongest years. Maybe a combination of maybe low interest rates, people not spending on other things like vacations, I'm not sure. But so there has been an increase of motor vehicle excise tax, which is a revenue of about $2.7 million a year. We're still cautiously estimating that at about 2.4 million for FY21, and we'll see how that closes out the year as we make our estimates. We're going to estimate about 2.7, I think, for 2022, and we'll see how we finish out the year in 2021 before we lock that in. Building inspection permits, another one that's obviously tied to economic activity. You can kind of see how this has fluctuated over time. It has been quite strong in recent years, obviously a drop in 20, and then obviously 21 again is also, we've lowered it because of the fact that there has been some reduced activity in that sector other than the larger commercial and residential projects that have been underway. So that's another one that is obviously sensitive to the economy and may be impacted by COVID-19. So when we look at some of our preliminary revenue estimates, and some of these are actual, we know what they are. Some of them are just preliminary estimates. Others are, based on the governor's budget. You can sort of see some of the things here that we're working with. I've already talked about the first three when I mentioned in that earlier slide under Prop 2.5. We're obviously looking at seeing a little more motor vehicle excise because of that overall statewide increase. We're going to cautiously move up hotel, motel, and meals slightly from where they were pretty drastically lowered to in 2021. Adult use marijuana, we're going to level fund because it really has not recovered or really, if anything, it's gone down slightly. So it has not, it's sort of lagged behind where it had been expected to be. And then we might see some slight increases in licenses and permits and hopefully parking in the latter half of the fiscal year. And state aid, obviously we've plugged in some of the state aid that we're expecting from the governor's budget. And then also we'll have to make up for the use of the 411 367. So that actually becomes a negative revenue that we have to then fill that hole because it's not a recurring revenue. Again, when you use the fiscal stability fund to fund the operating budget in the general fund, you have to replace that. So that actually represents a revenue loss that we'll have to replace before we add anything more from the stability fund. So in terms of our expenditures for 2022, again, 100 million plus budget. You can kind of see the breakdown, education, employee benefits, and largely that's healthcare for both city and school employees, public safety, which is police, fire, dispatch, parking, building, and I believe those are all the public safety departments that fall under that classification. And then you can see general government, public works, culture and recreation. When you actually take education as a whole, include all the employee benefits, which are paid on the city side, as well as debt service, it's about 54% of that pie goes towards education. It's always around 54 to 56% any given year, mostly depending on debt service, probably tips it back and forth a little bit. So these are some of the preliminary expenditure estimates that we're looking at. We know we have to increase our retirement contribution. That's sort of automatic in terms of meeting our actuarial tables. We've continued to slowly make investments in the other than post-employee benefits trust fund. Health insurance, we're using an estimate of a 5% increase. The Group Insurance Commission is actually right in the middle of its rate setting process right now. And they are doing public hearings on the various plans. That won't really be resolved until March, when we'll have a firm number as to what our Health New England rates, which is our primary plan, will be. But right now, working with a 5% estimate increase, we know that we'll have to come up with about $580,000 in new expenditures to cover that. Then there's some other smaller areas that we have to work on. Debt payments estimated, replacing that capital stabilization and cash capital, which we've consistently funded in the past. That will represent an increase. Obviously, the increased charter school sending tuition that I referred to. We haven't started the departmental budget process for either city or schools. That'll begin once this commences. So we just have a placeholder in there of departmental budgets for city and schools, sort of a round number of 2.5 million. And again, Fiscal Stability Fund will be part of that as well. We will have to, once we have all the other numbers and we can develop that plan, there will likely be a contribution to the Fiscal Stability Fund because that's sort of how the model works. We use some revenues to support the budget, that we also put some revenues in reserve to be able to fund the out year. So that's sort of also a work in progress as we develop that and the other budget estimates. So what does this all mean relative to how we were going to approach budgeting for 2022? Obviously, the $2.5 million override that was approved in March was delayed. It will be implemented to advance our ongoing stability efforts. We're going to obviously continue to try to maintain our competitive residential and commercial tax rate, which was recently affirmed late last fall by the City Council, to keep us competitive with neighboring communities. Our single family home values continue to remain strong as we continue to maintain excellent municipal services in schools and public safety and public health. New growth, we hope, will continue to be strong. It has continued to be strong even during the pandemic, which provides us with additional levy capacity. And again, we're estimating that that could be $750,000 in additional revenue in 2022. Local receipts, obviously, we hope will begin a slow rebound over this year, moving into 2023, as we get people vaccinated and we get people back to work, and we're able to open our economy a little more robustly. So some of those local revenues that we've seen lag, we hope will begin to rebound. And then of course, we'll make a contribution to the Fiscal Stability Fund, as I mentioned before, to be able to make sure that we can keep that plan on track to maintain stability over the next 5 years, if possible. So the Fiscal Stability Plan, obviously I mentioned it before. Again, here's the chart that sort of shows it back to its creation in 2014 when we passed the first override of 2.5 million. We used all but the 774,000 of that to fill a massive gap in our budget for 2014, fiscal year 2014. And then each year after that, we again used some of the new revenues, but put money into the fund to build up the fund, and then began to draw down on the fund once we got into 2019, and we began to run up against that inevitable crunch between expenses and revenues with the capping of our local revenues and flat state aid. So we began to slowly draw down. We were at 277, 850, 775, 874. Obviously for 2021, we were prepared to use almost $1 million at that point to make up for the loss of the override, which we then, because we delayed to 2022, we did eventually have to use 411, 367 because we had made the other cuts. So the challenge now will be to figure out how we map out another 5 years starting with FY 2022, factoring in how much we'll use of the override funds that were adopted on March of 2020 to help stabilize the FY 22 fiscal budget, and then obviously building up the fund with a model that shows how we would need to then start to draw on them over the next several years. I say we, obviously this will be my last budget as mayor, and but obviously I want to be able to create a budget that not only helps us meet our needs in fiscal year 2022, but is also fiscally responsible and sets us on a stable glide path for whoever the next mayor is who comes into office in January of 2022. So that's the Fiscal Stability Plan, and obviously that will be finalized as part of my budget submission to the council. This is the budget calendar for fiscal year 2022. Again, mostly set by the charter. This is this required joint meeting of the City Council and School Committee. I'll be submitting the 5-year capital improvement program at the beginning of March. Again, we had a slimmed down capital improvement program in 2021 that got disrupted by the pandemic. We'll probably again be looking at a very lean capital improvement program as well, again, because some of the uncertainties with COVID, but we will be submitting a capital improvement program. The deadline for both of our school districts to finalize their respective operating budgets and submit that to the mayor under the charter is April 17th, 2021. So the 2 school committees that I serve on will be sharpening their pencils and going to work on creating a budget, obviously in the same uncertain circumstances, and obviously with all of the challenges that COVID has presented for learning, and in particular, significant learning loss that we will all be grappling with for many years to come, and the costs associated with that. I am then required on May 17th to submit my proposed operating budget to the City Council on May 17th. At that point, the City Council takes it and has the opportunity to hold hearings and run its process. And then everything has to be wrapped up and voted on, obviously, by the last day of the fiscal year, June 30th, for the new fiscal year that will go into effect on July 1st of 2021. So that is the calendar. That's the overview. That's sort of the state of where we are, not only currently in 2021, but where we look to be heading as we put together the 2022 budget. Again, trying to figure out how we balance maintaining the services and the school services that we need, but also accounting for those pressures on our local revenues and trying to project when we can see those begin to climb out of the difficulty created by COVID-19. So at this point, I will stop. I will stop sharing, and I will open up to any questions from the school committee or city council. If you would use the raise hand function, and I can recognize members who may have questions or comments or not. I see a hand from Council President Chiara. Council President.
Thanks. I've actually never gotten to use the raise hand feature, though I talk about it all the time. Thank you for this presentation. As always, it's unbelievably detailed and really helps set us up to have these conversations for the next few months. So it's also very hard to imagine that this is the last one that you'll deliver to us. So thank you. As always, I have a question about the foundation budget. So as a minimum aid community, it's disappointing, but it's not surprising that we're not benefiting from the changes of the Student Opportunity Act. But one of the aspects that the governor is trumpeting is that the special education reimbursement and the charter tuition reimbursement is actually supposed to truly actually be funded for once. But it doesn't track with what I was seeing on your charts. So can you talk a little bit about that and why we're not seeing sort of the benefit of that?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering if Dr. Provost has anything to add to that, because he's been doing more of a deeper dive into these things, and I'd love to just have him actually defer to him on this if he wants to take a swing at it.
Sure, I can speak to the special education reimbursement, I think, better than the charter reimbursement, because there are fewer factors involved in the special ed reimbursement, so it's a more straightforward answer. I think the important thing to remember is that that's a reimbursement program for students who have extremely costly educational services, mainly out of district students. So the way the reimbursement program works is districts are reimbursed a portion up to 75% of their costs, which exceed 4 times the foundation amount. So that is about 75% reimbursement on costs in excess of $50,000. over the course of the past several years, we've been doing a lot of work to create more inclusive schools by building programs within our district, which has dramatically reduced the amount of students that we are sending out of district, which would trigger the reimbursement. So in a sense, it's I think a positive thing that the reimbursement for charter schools is going down, because it's only a reimbursement program, and it's only a reimbursement once you hit that $50,000 per student amount. I think that explains why you're seeing that decrease there.
And I would just add, I literally, we just got these, we just got these numbers, and we don't actually have, DESE hasn't yet put up the 22 data on their site for charter. So we don't actually have the census. Usually you can look at it and say, tuition's gone up, but we have the same number of students, and like what's happening, or and so our reimbursement is going up, or but they haven't put that information out yet for us to really unpack and understand. We can try to do that over the coming days when we start to get that data. But I know that they said that they were going to instead of phasing in over 5 years, they were going to shorten that window, even though they had never been paying it over 5 years, and they were going to try to front load more of it. But I still haven't had a chance to unpack it with just the numbers we have without having the student census numbers provided. So we'll have to work on that as well. So
okay. I guess we'll just keep hoping that that situation is going to change every year. I hope to see different.
Counselor Foster has her hand up next.
Thank you. I do, but it looked like, and I can't tell, Member Fallon, did you have something you were trying to add into that?
I just wanted to say I was on the DESE website today, and I thought it was funny that they put a note saying that the projected assessments and reimbursements for charter tuition payments at this point in time can be useful for budget planning, but should definitely not be viewed as final numbers. So.
Yeah. It's, again, these numbers will change for all throughout the process as the House and the Senate. So I don't, so we're going to have to continue to see what's happening in that realm. So Counselor Foster.
Thank you. And thank you for this overview. My internet cut out for a few minutes, so I apologize if I'm asking a question that you covered already. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the decision not to collect host community agreements from retail cannabis upfront, what impact that may have going forward, and kind of where that is coming from.
Sure. So you may remember from the town hall meetings, I don't have the slide on it now, that we had a slide that talked about revenue from cannabis, and there were sort of two boxes, very distinctly separate, with separate funding sources, and also distinctive uses. And so the excise tax revenue has always been incorporated into our operating budget. The mitigation funds have never been part of our operating budget. They've always been kept separate from the operating budget, and they're designed to specifically mitigate impacts of these cannabis facilities. And the other problem with them is that they have a 5-year limit on them. So they go away after 5 years. So another reason why we would never build them into our operating budgets. And so really the shift that's happening, I'm not actually giving up any mitigation funds. We still have and reserve the right to collect mitigation funds. What I've basically said is that, we now have 5 years of experience with this new industry. We have not seen the major impacts that were talked about, and the crime increase, and all the other horror stories that people were concerned about, primarily people who opposed legalization. What we have seen, though, is that we haven't seen access really in terms of equity applicants into this industry, and there's a major push, particularly for applicants who are members of disproportionately impacted communities, who are disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And so I pride the fact that Northampton has tried to be very progressive in terms of our approach. We have not put in place challenging regulations and, special permit requirements. And we basically have tried to treat these businesses like other businesses. We also didn't put caps on the number of retail facilities, which also drives up the cost because it makes these finite licenses very expensive, and people literally are in a bidding war to try to be one of the 5 or 6, which also disadvantages, I think, smaller entrepreneurs and equity applicants. And so one of my other concerns in trying to make sure that we are in fact having a broad investment of people in this new industry was putting up this barrier of collecting the money up front. And so really what I'm doing is I'm making a shift beginning in 2021 where we will reserve the right to collect it if and when an impact is identified for a specific facility, which is really, I think, what the law was intended to do. Many communities, because this law was enacted before, years before anyone would ever open a door and sell marijuana, we were trying to sort of create these agreements and create how they would operate. There was no template. So this has been the methodology that we've used, but I think Northampton has had more experience than any other community in the Commonwealth. We had the second medical dispensary in the state to open in 2015, and obviously the first retail adult use marijuana facility to open. We now have 3 open. We just had another, we had a manufacturing facility in the industrial park got its final license recently. We've got several other dispensaries that are open. And so I felt comfortable that we would make that shift. And we're the first community to do that. And I think other communities are going to follow suit, whether it happens voluntarily or whether eventually it will be ordered by a court. I predict it will be ordered by a court at some point in the very near future. But again, this is not going to have an impact on our operating budget because these monies have never been used to fund our operating budget and have been kept separate to use specifically for impact related funding. So that would be my answer. I tried to convey that in all the various interviews I did over the last week. This was not something that I put out a press release about, but folks in the cannabis industry sort of made a big deal about it. So it became kind of news statewide. But in every one of those interviews, I tried to emphasize that this isn't going to affect our operating budget because these aren't operating revenues and never have been.
May I ask a follow-up?
Sure can.
I just wanted to, you mentioned that you were reserving the right if an impact comes, and just suppose that impact is related to a street or a parking situation. When we're talking about equity, is it fair to think that we could ask one dispensary to pay this money because of something going on in their neighborhood versus the other entities in town?
Again, we would do it on a case-by-case basis. And again, the law is pretty clear. And actually, one of the new things, a new regulation that's been put in place by the Cannabis Commission is that cities and towns have to provide detailed, itemized breakdowns of what the actual costs are to the city as a direct impact of that facility. So yeah, so I think that there'd have to be something very specific, whatever. There was a dangerous, people were pulling out and it was creating a dangerous hazard and we had to, install some kind of a flashing beacon or something like that. We may ask them to help us with the cost of that. I think it would have to be very specific. In the case of Netta, obviously Netta, generated a lot of visitors to the city of Northampton, as Councillor Nash can attest. And so there were significant parking impacts and there were significant pedestrian safety impacts. And Netta was happy to have its mitigation money used to fund some of the street improvements that we did all around there, some on-street parking and sidewalk improvements, crosswalk improvements. And they actually helped fund some of the early design work for the Pleasant Street Gateway project. And we're working with them to help finish some of that work as well as some other projects. So we would work directly with them, and they would, obviously this would be a continued partnership to make sure that if there were impacts, we would work with them to provide the documentation and that they would pay. Again, capped it up to 3% of their revenues. And as someone in the Globe or somewhere said, that's actually probably how the law was supposed to work, but it's really not how it was implemented because it was all hypothetical at the time. So I think that you'd really have to show quite directly. The other thing that's probably going to happen, there was a bill that didn't pass the legislature this time, but there has been a bill to really have the Cannabis Control Commission regulate these host community agreements because they don't actually regulate them at all. They're not submitted to the Cannabis Control Commission. The only thing I submit or the applicant submits is an affidavit signed by myself and by the applicant that we've executed one. They have no direct oversight of them. So I think once that happens as well, there'll be some oversight of them. I will say I've tried to hew as closely as I can to the law. I have not used it to, buy fire trucks or buy, other kinds of things or ask them to provide those kinds of things. We have tried to keep it in a fund that we only use for things that are related to that facility. And we've always had good communication with them that they were supportive of how those funds were being used. And they've been good community partners. So that's what I would say about the HCA issue. I think you're going to see a major policy shift happening. And I think, again, will be the norm, not the exception, I'm sure, when we talk about this next year.
First again.
First again, yes.
Thank you.
First chocolate bar, first HCAs, all those things. Okay, the next person who has their hand up is Member Fallon from the school committee.
Thanks. Can you just clarify? It said in the governor's budget that he proposed allowing cities and towns to count 114 million in federal dollars toward the local contribution under the law. I don't even know what he's referring to. Is that the ESSER funding that we received and probably
I do not. I must confess to you that I have not read the budget in that level of detail. We got the cherry sheet late last night and I was more focused on this budget. So I don't know whether John or Susan or anyone might have an answer to that, but I see the superintendent shade. Well, I'll have to look at that and find out.
Okay, so yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't know if, I'm assuming it wouldn't make a significant difference to our budget if it's only 114 million total statewide, but I didn't know if it was already accounted for in what you just presented, but obviously it hasn't been.
I don't think we've received any guidance yet on this from DESE or DOR. Certainly not in the initial, cherry sheets we've been given. So hopefully in the days and weeks ahead, if there is actual guidance on that, we can share that with you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, Member Voss.
Thank you so much. I have two questions, and I'm also going to just say that was a fantastic presentation, and I really appreciated it a lot. My first question is
Can I just before you continue, Susan, I also want to give credit to Susan Wright, our finance director, who obviously has always had a big part in creating these, and obviously she also announced she's retiring in June, so this is her last budget presentation as well. So I just want to make sure I gave her a shout out as well. How many days, Susan?
I think about 105.
Okay, but who's counting?
Work days.
Okay. All right. So sorry, I just wanted to make sure I got that in. As you were praising the presentation, I want to make sure the credit was shared properly with Susan Wright, who actually spent 10 years as finance director and was 7 years as business manager for the school. So she's had a career both in NPS and with the city. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'll echo that. It was well presented verbally and visually and much appreciated. So I have one question just to make sure I understand it on one of the slides toward the end, if you don't mind putting it up, the fiscal stability plan.
Sure.
And after this question, then I have a more specific one related to the school budget.
Okay. Let me just go back.
It might be like 3 from the end.
Okay. Yep. Yep. Let me just. It's this one.
This is the one.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Is it correct to interpret our current, last year 2021 there as somewhere we contributed 507,000 to that, but to that fund, but we spent 411 out of it. In a normal year, we would hope to not be in the blue at all, but really the net is we didn't lose money in it in this outrageously difficult year. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, it's funny. Let me, I'm actually going to ask Susan on that one, because this, I actually hadn't noticed that when you mentioned that. Obviously the funds that we've added to the stabilization fund year over year, the 507, 546 would be something that we added to the fund. And then obviously originally it was almost $1 million. I'm going to have Susan speak to that just to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting this slide.
Yeah, no, that is correct. We used to balance the budget 411,367, and then in January, just at the last council,
That's right.
we,
Yeah.
added back in
Yeah.
$500,000 from our free cash.
That's right. Yeah.
And the odd number, the 7,548, the stabilization funds retain the interest that they are accruing. So that's why we put in 500,000, but so far this year, the fund has also earned another 7,500 in interest.
So just to say that, say that slightly differently. So we didn't actually put the money in as part of the FY 2021 budget. What happened was, after our free cash was certified, but still in fiscal year 2021, just a couple of weeks ago, we got our free cash, which was from 2020. And as we often do each year, we distribute money. So we actually it was actually more, we were replenishing it, or we were trying to replenish monies that were taken out. So we did put that money in, but it wasn't as part of the 2021 budget. When we passed the 2021 budget, the 507, 546 wasn't part of the equation, but we just added it mid-fiscal year using the free cash that was certified.
Thank you. I guess maybe I'll, if you don't mind, ask a related question just to make sure I understand. Each year, does part of the budget have an amount that it hopes to add to this fund? And if so, what is that amount?
So basically what we try to, we basically create a model of revenues and expenses, much like the revenue and expense charts in the overall budget. And we basically project out in each fiscal year what we think what we think the increases are going to be that be needed to fund, level service, fund our budgets. And then we basically try to build a model to how much we would need to use of the new revenues generated by the override to stabilize the budget, but not use all of them. Put some into the. I wish I had the plan, because it actually shows you how it's putting. You then have to move money from the fund to you start to see gaps in the out years in the fiscal stability plan. You start to run deficits. So you're building up the plan knowing that you're then going to start to see deficits, and those deficits grow exponentially. And obviously, it would have grown, from 2020, we were facing a much bigger deficit. Obviously we made cuts. We pretty much level funded or cut the budget. But if we were trying to fund level services, we would have had to have made a significant withdrawal from the fiscal stability plan to do that. The problem, of course, is that if you make a rapid withdrawal like that, then you're basically going off the cliff at that point, because in the next fiscal year, you've then got to dig yourself out of that big withdrawal and then put revenue in over and above that to meet your increases. So it'd be easier if I had the plan and I could, it's in the beginning of the budget, but you can sort of see how it operates, but I can send it to you from the 2021 budget.
Thank you. This was helpful. I was mimisinterpreting it, and what you both shared is very helpful. I appreciate it.
Susan has a spreadsheet that sort of play with these calculations to figure out how the moving pieces work, but that's sort of how we do it.
No, I appreciate it. And I do have a more specific question too, and then I'll let somebody else go, but I'm done looking at it if you want to stop sharing it.
Okay.
Thank you both. It's not directly related to that question, but could you just, you and maybe Dr. Provost, say, and this is a little school committee centric, but I think it's appropriate. You know, we had a big negotiation 2 years ago, and I could really use a refresher on the big picture of how the override fits into handling paying for the increases. And you know, what I can share with others, some of the school committee members are new since all of that, was I kept hearing the first year of the increases isn't such a big deal. And so when the override was delayed, things seemed to work okay. But my big picture understanding is going into this budget season, the raises that we agreed to are a pretty big deal in terms of we really need that override money. And do any of the changes that were made this year have a different effect? And just what should school committee know about that going into this budget season?
Yeah, I mean, I can, you know, I'll defer a little bit to John and Cammie on some of those specific calculations, which they may or may not have done, but obviously we incorporated into our fiscal stability plan some of those calculations on what we would need to be able to meet those obligations under the contract. And to be clear, even with canceling the override and making those cuts, the one area we didn't make cuts was on the school side. And even though the city budget was going down by, you know, a little under 1%, we increased the school appropriation by 3.6%. So we made an increase there. That was one of the two areas I didn't want to make cuts to, were public safety, public education, and sort of public health, sort of also in that public safety realm. So we did make a significant increase and had to support that. And we would obviously, all of our calculations for FY 2022 would factor that in. All of both our city and school contracts are closed still, so we know what those numbers will be. And so we'll have to factor that in as part of Dr. Provost's budget making process as well. So I don't know if John wants to add anything more to that in terms of what you're projecting.
Sure. And this is the time I'll bring Cammie in to back me up. I can tell you that we started our budget process yesterday with a day-long alt budget retreat. Of course, one of the first pieces of that budget is to figure out what level services costs. That is a little bit of a tricky problem this year because there were so many COVID-related expenses and so many COVID-related staff that we added into the budget this year in order just to get schools reopened. I think the number around of the just COVID-related expenses is close to $1.5 million. So when we look at our level services budget as sort of the foundation for building our next budget proposal, we back all those COVID-related expenses out and try to go back to the staff that we had prior to COVID's emergence on the scene, and then roll those staff forward with steps and any potential lane changes. So, and again, we're still fine-tuning a number of those amounts, but we believe the best estimate we can give of that sort of base cost of the wage increases is about 1.3 million. So there are some COVID expenses that I think will continue until next year. You know, obviously COVID has tricked me so many times that I don't pretend to have a crystal ball, but I could imagine that some of the health personnel we've added might have to be there at least for a portion of the year. I could see us having PPE expenses continuing into at least a portion of the year. And so we're trying to get a handle on that as we prepare our budget for first view, which we'll be presenting about a month from today.
Thank you.
And just the city side, for the city council, you know, again, we have closed contracts with all of our city unions. So as we meet with department heads and we ask them to put together their budgets, they'll have those numbers based on the contracts about how each payroll side, at least on city departments, will have to go up as well. So that'll be factored in to our work on the city side. Member Seraphy Cox from the school committee.
Thank you. And reiterating thanks for the very clear numbers and graphs and so forth. It really helps with long-term planning. So hopefully those will continue with the new folks moving forward. I have two kind of questions. One is that the residential tax rate comparison was one of the first slides that you had that showed us kind of in the bottom of the middle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering that number that you were quoting there for the residential tax rate, is that factoring in the increase with the override?
That's the FY 2021 tax rate. So no, it's not part of that. So it would not be part of that. The FY 2022 tax rate would incorporate any changes in the override. Yes.
And okay, very good. And do you have any expectations about how our positionality will change in that graph once the override is implemented?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you exactly.
Sure.
Obviously, other communities are going to move up, you know, the 2.5% as well, and it's the way the tax rate is set after the budget is set. This question came up a lot during the during the town hall meetings as well, and you know, like East Hampton, for example, you know, did these major school projects, you know, so there's these special cases, like they did that big high school project and they're doing that huge consolidated elementary school project. So they may jump because of that. So there's a lot of other special cases. So I guess the short answer is no, I can't tell you exactly what it will do. And then there's also, remember I mentioned in the slide, there's that other concern we have about, you know, commercial values and what may happen there. So there's, at this point, I can't tell you. I mean, we have pretty consistently been in sort of the lower half of the pack on the residential side. So I don't see us making a major jump, but obviously with the 2.5, that definitely will increase our tax rate relative to other communities. I just can't tell you for sure if it'll move us up 2 positions or 1 position or 3 positions.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you. My second question is about the when you showed the planned increase, or that you're projecting an increase in restaurant receipts, etc. I'm wondering, you know, the CDC just came out with their recommendations about how to reopen in-person schooling, and that one of those recommendations was to close indoor dining. And so I wondered, you know, this budget, I'm assuming that this budget assumes that we will not be closing indoor dining. And I'm wondering what impact you would see on those revenues if we were to close indoor dining in order to reopen in-person schools.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, Northampton has been very conservative. Our health department's been fairly conservative in terms of, you know, the phases, the state phases versus local phases, including with restaurants. You know, we lagged behind when the governor moved forward in a couple of phases. We stayed put and didn't increase indoor capacity, and in some cases, you know, we've stayed 2 steps behind. So I know that that's something that that the health department's mindful of, but also just keep in mind that I'm showing an increase from 22 over 21, but one was really sharply decreased as well. So it's not like I'm saying happy days are here again. I'm saying we're going to be doing slightly less worse than we were doing in FY 2021. But in terms of it, again, indoor dining, many of our restaurants in Northampton haven't really embraced indoor dining, even if they could. Many restaurants have closed for the winter and just said, we're not gonna, once outdoor dining ended, I think about Spoletos, I think about Packard's, I think about a number of restaurants who just said, yep, see you in the springtime. And also just as a factor of the size of their restaurant and trying to keep staff safe. So I'm certainly not projecting increases because I want, I'm just trying to be optimistic that the sort of the bottom that we hit in 2021 is going to rebound slightly. And obviously with the vaccine and wide distribution of the vaccine, that'll also play a role. But I also think the work we're doing around contact tracing aggressively, including in the schools, we're doing aggressive contact tracing in our restaurant industry. We've actually been offering, the last several weeks, we've been offering testing to restaurant employees at the city's expense to help with what we were seeing. Not so much transmission in restaurants, mostly community transmission, out in gatherings, holiday gatherings, things like that, that then staff were transmitting with each other. Sometimes staff that worked in different restaurants but were family members having family transmission that way. So we've been really aggressive in trying to keep those workers safe and keep dining safe. So I don't know. I don't see us moving aggressively ahead of the state for sure. And I don't know really what the governor's plans are for his next phases. But my hope is we're going to get teachers and school staff moved up in the vaccination process and get them vaccinated sooner, as well as frontline workers in restaurant as well, and that we can try to keep both safe as we try to reopen schools and reopen our economy.
Great, thank you.
Member Levy from the school committee. And I'll echo the gratitude for this incredibly comprehensive and really clear presentation. I actually had a very similar question to Member Seraphy Cox. So my only other question is, I think a really simple one. I just want to ensure I'm clear with the combination of Prop 2.5 and the override. I know that last year there was, I guess the question is, can people expect to see the same increase that they would have seen last year had the override been implemented, or will it be different in any way?
I think that, well, we have a calculator on the website still that basically calculated the impact of the additional 2.5 million. And that would probably still work if they put in their current tax bills. Obviously, we were doing this in 2020, talking about FY 2021. But if they have a current year tax bill, I don't know. I'd have to check what database we were pulling from, but basically we were focusing on the extra 2.5 million that was being added. And so again, the way that that's spread out across, across each person's taxes based on the value, the assessment of their property at a given time, basically their tax bill, that should be fairly consistent. Obviously, it'll be a little bit different because we've moved, with Prop 2.5, the levy went up by the 2.5% since then. But in terms of understanding what the impact of the 2.5 million, that should be fairly consistent.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering whether that the levy impacted what people's overall payments would be, but it sounds like it would not.
Well, the 2.5% will mean an increase in what people will pay on their property taxes. But in terms of specifically calculating it, the thing that we can only give them sort of exact understanding of is what the value of that $2.5 million increase to the levy would be on their specific property, which is what we did during the override debate. So there is some information about that, but
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just looking for some transparency for folks about sort of what the increase will be that they can expect and where it's coming from, given that
it's sort of now we've got the combining 2.5 plus the override.
Yeah. So the override was 2.5 million, and then we have the normal 2.5% increase that happens automatically, gets calculated by the state as part of our levy that we build into our budget every year. So you're right. There's those two moving pieces that usually it's just the 2.5%, and so that obviously was something we talked about during the town hall meetings. And so the easiest way to understand the difference is that calculator, which shows the $2.5 million impact, is the clearest way I can give a person an exact answer about it. And then the other problem is that people's values go up and down too. Like neighborhood values change every year. Somebody sells a house for a lot of money on a street next door. All those house values change and your values may go down. Like values are moving up and down. So that's why it's impossible to say your tax bill will be exactly this much next year. All we can do is provide, a calculator which sort of reflects what it was and what the 2.5 million would add to it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Jarrett has the next hand.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you and Susan for this report. Very helpful. I have two questions. If you could speak to your decision to implement the 2.5 override this year. I'm seeing that even if we see the beginnings of a recovery, it seems likely it will take a while for the recession and the difficulties many people are facing to ease. And what would our outlook look like to delay implementation another year or to do a partial implementation?
Yeah, I feel like, there was a little bit of concern when I delayed it the last time because, we had a democratic election and we had a community-wide debate about it. And we, were looking at priorities for the city in terms of funding schools and funding our city services. And the voters spoke and said that, the taxpayers voted to do this. And so I feel like, I really don't feel like I'm in a position to defer it any further. And I was very clear at the time that I was going to delay it for 1 year. And so really that's the approach that I'm going to take with it. I don't feel like I'm empowered to wipe out that vote. And so I feel like I need to implement it. And also, what it meant last year was, cutting almost, it ended up being over almost 25 city employees. And again, that was what we were trying to get away from when we implemented the stability plan, was year after year, sitting down at the budget table with the school committee, sitting down at the budget table with the mayor and city council and saying, what do we have to cut this year to balance the budget? That was pretty much during my entire time on the council, was how every budget year went. What are we cutting this year? And the same with the school committee. And so I feel like that was what that election was about. And so that's the approach I'm taking.
And have we seen much in the way of people getting more behind on their property taxes?
We did have, the governor did pass some emergency orders, which did allow people to delay payments. And so people did avail themselves of that. I'd have to check in terms of where we are in terms of tax title. We always have a universe of tax titled properties. Most of the time they're owner unknown. Our collections have remained very strong in terms of percentages. I guess I could do some research and let you know about that if we've seen a marked increase in that. I would assume certainly if there are people. So Susan Wright is telling me that that we have the same number of tax titles this year that we had last year. So that hasn't really changed. And again, sometimes it's properties that we don't have an owner on and they're just building up a tax title. And sometimes we end up just buying those properties to take them out of tax title. But so we haven't seen an increase there. And then I guess the other thing to keep in mind is that if we defer any longer, we're going to basically need to drain the entire fiscal stability fund And at that point, then fasten your seatbelts, because we're going to make significant cuts, like big time cuts in the schools. I mean, you'll have to go to the schools at 55% of your budget. So if we have to start making cuts on the order of 2 million or something like that, then we're going to go right back to where we were pre-2013. So that's my other concern. I realize it's challenging, but at the same time, people are relying. I was down touring, folks lining up at the senior center to get that vaccine from our public health nurses and our first responders. And obviously the work that's going on in our schools and the work that's happening, all throughout the city during the pandemic, people are relying on those services. So I also feel like we have an obligation to continue to maintain those services and not to set them on a path basically where we're going to have to start making massive cuts, because the state is obviously not going to come to the rescue, despite Governor Baker's rosy press release about the Student Opportunity Act. So I feel like at least for me as mayor, putting forward a budget, I have to be responsible in doing that. So that's my position on it.
Right, I appreciate that explanation. I also appreciate the proactive stance you've taken on adding additional exemptions as we're allowed to under state law for our more vulnerable populations, and encourage us to continue to look at that if there's anything else we can add.
And you may have seen one of the things that we were projecting as an increase in expenses, in that long list of new expenditure increases, was adding additional capacity to what's called the overlay for abatements, because we have increased the number of abatements that are available. So that's a way to absorb those abatements as well. So we are anticipating, and we hope that more people will take advantage of those programs. So we are factoring that into our budget as well. So thank you. And thanks for your advocacy on that issue.
Great. And second question goes back to the host community agreement. Have we seen any increase in teen marijuana use since the legalization? And if so, could we use the impact money to address that and provide counseling in the schools?
So I know that we do receive reports. I don't believe we've received this year reports about that. I have not been given any data or evidence that the legalization of marijuana has increased underage marijuana use. We were having marijuana was something that students were using, particularly in the high school level. That the Prevention Coalition was bringing us information about. And I have not seen evidence that legalization, if anything, one of the things about legalization is hopefully to get rid of the black market, to have marijuana that's safe and tested. And obviously there's all kinds of restrictions on packaging. I know we haven't had issues in terms of, investigations of diversions or things like that have occurred. So I have not seen that evidence, and I know a lot of the data from the industry in other parts of the country, contrary to the concerns that were raised opposing legalization, it's never really borne out that it's resulted in youth increase. So that one is a little bit more tenuous in terms of how I could tie that to one operator would be responsible for that. So so that's one that I don't believe is something we would use these funds to support.
Thank you.
Councilor Maori.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for your presentation. Staying on the engaging topic of cannabis, I was actually dismayed to learn that the state seems to not be requiring cannabis delivery services to provide any revenue to their host municipalities. And I was wondering if you think that will play out in any way, and if it will impact our future, because the delivery services are taking business from the establishments that are actually giving revenue to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a source of controversy, and actually in the last week controversy. Uh, uh, I followed the regulatory process on that, and I'm on the Cannabis Commission's advisory board as a municipal representative, and I know that there was some concern and controversy about that. I didn't actually, and there was a group of municipalities that opposed it and a group of producers that opposed it. I actually didn't oppose it. And actually, to their credit, Netta did not oppose it. And actually, Netta voted not to join the lawsuit that the industry put forward about these regulations, and actually resigned in protest from the Massachusetts Cannabis Association last week. And really, I mean, the effort to try to get equity ownership in the cannabis market has largely failed. And it's been really challenging. And because of lack of access to capital, and because of obviously the regulatory barriers and the costs, and some would argue some have argued that the host community agreements and the expensive mitigation costs, and so I know that in the delivery arena, they're really putting a focus on giving first and high priority to equity applicants and members of disproportionately impacted communities. So I realize there's a concern about that. I think these are going to be smaller operators. They're going to be kind of like a third-party delivery service, and actually, we've been contacted by one. By someone who's interested in it, and they're again one of our few equity applicants that's come forward, that wants to do something in Northampton. So I've not opposed it, and I feel like this industry should be open to everyone, and not just big Canadian firms that buy out Ohio firms that buy out Massachusetts firms. And that's really what's happened so far in the industry. So yeah, it's a concern. It may affect our revenue slightly, but the fact that Netta, which is the largest player in cannabis in Massachusetts, feels like it's not going to be a major impact, and the trade-off is worth it, that gives me comfort.
Right. I would like to hold that it's possible to provide revenue to the host cities and have equity. I think the equity issue is something that really needs to be separate from that, and really look at the procedures and in the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know it's a fairly new regulation. I know the industry dropped the lawsuit last week after half their members quit.
Wow. I didn't know all this drama.
It did create a lot of drama. It did. And again, we'll see, as with most things, we'll see how it actually plays out in reality. There's a lot of fear and a lot of concern about it, but delivery has always been seen as one of the least capital intensive sectors, and they've been really trying to prioritize equity participation in that sector. And so I think this is also part of that. So we'll see. I mean, I guess I'm not concerned, but maybe we'll be proven wrong, but I feel comfortable, at least the rules that have been adopted, and we'll see how they play out. Rules can be amended, rules can be changed. But like I said, we've already had our first inquiry about it in Northampton. So people are looking to get into it.
Well, thank you for that background. And I just feel compelled to thank you and comment on the idea of getting K through 12 teachers and staff moved up in the phases. I was very disappointed to see that not being true at the moment. So do you think is that something that, I know this isn't really a budget question. So
well, our superintendents and all the superintendents in the Valley have just signed a letter in solidarity to the secretary and to the commissioner, saying that they should be moved up. And I know that obviously the MTA and all of the individual collective bargaining units at various districts have been advocating for that. So, you know, we're hopeful. I mean, the big challenge is going to be just getting the supply, getting the supply of vaccine to even finish, the phase 1 and get into the phase 2 people that are supposed to start on February 1st. And we're having a hard time, I think there was a little bit of a breakthrough today, thanks to advocacy from our legislators. We were in this situation where we were, all ready to give 1,200 shots, and they were only sending us 100 doses. And so it's just been, especially in Hampshire and Franklin County, it's been really bleak. So we're hoping that they're going to get that fixed. The computer, the sign-in system has been a bit of a nightmare. It's really challenging, especially for seniors. And so I know there's a lot of outcry about making that easier. But yeah, I think we need to get everybody vaccinated, and the sooner we get more vaccine into the system, the sooner we can move through all of those different phases as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you for your advocacy on that, Mayor.
I mean, I will say, I just want to echo it again, because I just want to make sure I give kudos to our health department. We've been doing testing for school employees and making testing available to school employees as well, as part of our municipal testing program. So that's been something we've been trying to do in the interim, while we're, to keep folks safe while we're working on getting the vaccination program accelerated. So. Okay, Councillor Quinlan is the next person with their hand up.
Well, just like everyone that asked the question before me, thank you so much for this very thorough presentation. It's so informative. And I just wanted to ask a question, kind of looking at the participation of the state and federal governments in funding this municipality. You pointed out that historically speaking, in 2002, there was $14 million in state aid to the city of Northampton, but obviously our total budget at that time wasn't $100 million like it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're getting $10 million on a $100 million budget. I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit about what that percentage was in 2002, if you know that.
Yeah, I mean,
I also, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And then I also just wanted to ask you also about the federal revenue. You pointed out that it was 0.8%. Has that been a similar decrease over the years as well? Just sort of historical.
Yeah, I mean, we've done variations on charts about this over time, and I know that state aid, we were doing look backs 10, 15, 20 years, and now it's down to whatever it is, 14 or 15%. And there was a time where it was as much as 30 to 35%. And you can sort of track the shift of, as state aid decreased, that, then obviously our percentage funded by local property taxes went up, and that's, so you can sort of track that. The federal government, it's a little bit tricky because those are revenues that come to the city. There's obviously direct grant funds that come to the schools that fund, Title I and some specific grant programs, but just in terms of revenue from the federal government directly, that has definitely shrunk. I'd have to look back at what it's pretty much low the entire time I've been mayor. It's been, fairly insignificant. And that probably dates back to, the 80s and the massive, tax cuts that occurred, and, the sort of defunding of the state sort of federal government sort of backing out of the obligations it used to have to the states. Everything got wrapped up into, formula grants and less money and more programs wrapped together. So, but definitely I can look back, but we definitely have had slides in the past that kind of showed how, the percentage of the pie. I think it might have even been one in the override presentation that just showed the difference 10 or 15 years ago, how much state aid represented versus now. And you're exactly right. That $10 million stays the same, but that's not adjusted for inflation. Right. So that the buying power of that $10 million of state aid is not what it was 10 years ago, as inflation has marched up and healthcare has gone up and all those other things.
And last year you were able to email us this presentation. Will we have that?
Yep, it's posted on the city's website, I think, already, but we can email it out to you as well.
It's on the website.
So we can make sure we email it out to you. Yeah, we were literally making edits at about 6 o'clock tonight. So it was sort of a work in progress right up to the end. So I'll make sure that it goes out to Annie and to Laura to be and Deb Carver to be distributed out to the 3 bodies.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Again, this is sort of the charter says that we must all convene. And I think part of it is because we want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page as, the city goes off to work on its part of the budget, and then the schools go off and work on their part of the budget. And then slowly they get kind of merged together into one overall operating budget. So I think that's the purpose of this meeting. We used to hold it oddly at the end of the process. In the pre-new charter days, it was sort of a joint meeting that happened. But at that point, it was so late and everything had already, budgets had already been drafted, everything was already done. And I just never found it very useful to have that meeting in June. So at least now we're all starting with the same numbers, the same, understanding of what the revenue pictures look like as we move forward in the process. So thank you. And again, thank you again to Susan and to the rest of my team for their assistance in getting this pulled together for tonight. And obviously we'll take any follow-up questions you have if you think of them, later in the week going forward. Okay, if there's no other questions or comments, I would entertain a motion to
Move to adjourn, please.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, I will ask the clerk to call the roll to adjourn this joint meeting.
Councillor Dwight,
Yes.
Councillor Foster,
Yes.
Councillor Jarrett,
Yes.
Councillor Labarge,
You're muted, Councillor Labarge.
Thank you, Counselor. Yes.
Councillor Maori,
Yes.
Councillor Nash,
Yes.
Councillor Quinlan,
Yes.
Councillor Shara,
Yes.
and Councillor Thorpe.
Yes.
And then Member Basansky. She wasn't here at the beginning. I didn't know if she'd arrived. Okay, Member Condon,
Yes.
Member Fallon,
Yes.
Member Gold,
Yes.
Member Goldman,
Yes.
Member Kaufman,
Yes.
Member Levy,
Yes.
Mayor Narkowitz,
Yes.
Member Seraphy Cox,
Yes.
and Member Voss.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
I
you.
believe it's unanimous. So again, this joint meeting of the City Council and School Committees is hereby adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.